Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We now come to the first proper session of the conference, which is entitled Restitution, Looking Back and Lessons for the Future. My name is Thomas Rowe. I'm professor of history here at the Diplomatic Academy, and my job this morning is to welcome and to introduce Hans Winkler. But before I do so, I thought I might sketch out, sort of set the scene for this first session of our conference and make a few introductory remarks which are particularly directed to some of our students who are here to set the scene. It seems to me this morning we're looking at two broad stories. The first story is the treatment by Austria of the victims of National Socialism. The second big story is Austria's coming to terms with its National Socialist past. These are the big stories behind the scene. And of course, we're interested in the American connection with both of these stories. Now, our starting point, our punto di partenza, is something very precise, and that is the Washington Agreement of 2001. So this took place 21 years ago, and we would have liked to have commemorated it last year, but the pandemic intervened. Now, what was the Washington Agreement, and why is it so important? Well, I'll read you the statement of what it was. It is the agreement between the Austrian federal government and the government of the United States of America on the settlement of questions concerning compensation and restitution for victims of National Socialism. And in my opinion, our opinion, this is one of the most important moments in the diplomatic history of the relations between the United States and Austria. It's a real turning point and a key moment. So this is our starting point today. Now, how are we going to go about this? It seems to me there are three dimensions and one question of the problem. The first dimension is the specific issue of restitution and compensation. In other words, the problem was, how do you find a just and fair settlement for the Austrian victims for the victims of National Socialism? This is the first and focused issue. The second dimension is the context within which this takes place, and that is the long and difficult process of Austria coming to terms with its National Socialist past. There is a third dimension to all of this too, which is the relationship to these processes and the United States of America, which is very much present throughout. The question mark at the end of today, where we are headed, is when we look back on the Austrian case, are there lessons that can be drawn? If we look at the Austrian case, what have we learned? Are there lessons that might be applied to other cases in the world today, or conceivably even in the future when we look, hopefully, at a settlement of the Russian-Ukrainian war? So these are the three dimensions and the question mark. Let me just say something quickly for the students. Why is restitution and compensation so important? What is at stake here? Restitution basically means giving back, returning that which has been stolen or improperly taken. That's the heart of restitution. Compensation means paying damages. It means making up for the losses incurred by the victims. So the restitution and compensation are really two parts of the same thing. And with students, I would say, if you want to have an image of your mind, Austria has provided the most iconic image of restitution, which is an icon itself, which I think in the popular imagination is very well known. Of course, it's the Golden Lady. It's Gustav Klimt's famous portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer, which is now known throughout the world because of the movie that goes with it, or derived from it. The second dimension has to do with Austria's coming to terms with its National Socialist past. This has been a long, drawn-out, much delayed, proceeding through fits and starts, complicated procedure. And eventually, Professor Rathkolb, fortunately, has arrived, and I hope he will help steer us through this question. I would like to mention just three key moments where the United States was particularly connected to this story. The first, of course, is 1943, the Moscow Declaration. This is the beginning of the victim myth, which lasted for so long. The second moment is the middle of the 1980s, the Wartime Affair. Again, this galvanized American public opinion. The third moment was 2000 and the formation of a government here in Austria in which the Freedom Party, the FPÖ, came in. These are three moments in this process where the United States connected in particular. At this point, I need to mention that Kurt Waldheim is an alumnus, a graduate of the Consular Academy. And if you look at the institutional genealogy of the Diplomatic Academy, that is one of our forerunners. So Waldheim's story, we have to acknowledge, is very much part of our own story as a Diplomatic Academy, too. Now, on the third dimension of this, it has to do with the United States and the role of Americans. And I think there are two aspects to this. The first aspect has already been mentioned, and this is the fact that so many thousands of people found in the United States a refuge from anti-Semitism and from Nazi persecution. And this is a large population which has made fundamental contributions to American life. And I think this will come out in the other sessions of the conference, exactly how important this was. And this population, their families, their descendants, obviously had a quest for justice. And this is a big part of this story. The second aspect of America's involvement has to do with official United States government foreign policy. It was to back this up. And in a sense, all three of these dimensions are what came together around 2000 to lead to the Washington Agreement. The fact of the importance of having a decent settlement, the political crisis and the discussion in Austria, and pressure from the United States of America. Now, in conclusion, I would like to mention two personalities, two figures from the Diplomatic Academy who played an important role in all of this. Both of them are graduates of this institution. Both of them had distinguished careers in diplomacy and public service. Both of them served as director of this institution. The first is Ernst Sucharipa. He graduated from the DLG in 1974. It was he who was named the special envoy by the Austrian government to carry out this restitution negotiations. He was director of the Diplomatic Academy between 1999 and 2005. Ernst Sucharipa died in 2005. The second figure is Hans Winkler. Hans graduated a few years before Ernst in 1970. He too has had a distinguished career in diplomacy and public service. He was state secretary in the Austrian government at the end. He was director of the Diplomatic Academy between 2009 and 2017. And quite frankly, I can think of no person better equipped to explain the mysteries and background and story of restitution than Hans Winkler. So Hans, welcome back. Thank you. And the podium is yours.
Thank you very much, Tom. I haven't heard this in a long time. Thank you very much. I feel very honored to be here today at this conference on the occasion of something that has really influenced Austrian history. And I had the opportunity to talk about this subject already before. Professor Baer, you will remember that you invited me in, when was it, 2013, to speak at the 5th annual Botstiber lecture on Austrian-American affairs on coming to terms with Austria's past, the role of the United States. I remember that very well, and I'm extremely happy, ladies and gentlemen, to be able to talk about this subject again. However, it never, ever occurred to me on those occasions that once again in Europe, in the year 2022, we would have to see this subject in the context of a real ongoing war, a war of aggression and a flagrant violation of the fundamental principles of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. Once again, we are confronted with soldiers dying in the battlefield, civilians being killed, with war crimes and crimes against humanity being committed, and with the destruction of property in an unprecedented dimension. So when we talk today about restitution and compensation, and Emin, I have to say, you're right. We talk a lot about the past, the role of the United States in coming to terms, and the influence that the United States had in this coming to terms, but I think it's important. But I'm sure, and I already heard a lot about the forthcoming subjects that will be dealt with. There will be enough subjects also for the future. But so again, we will have to talk about restitution and compensation for victims of the criminal and inhuman activities of the National Socialists, but in the future, probably also of Russian forces and those responsible for it. Somehow, I feel depressed because it seems that humankind has not learned much from history. Allow me, because this is a very special occasion after all, to say a few words a little bit out of the box. This raid against Ukraine without cause and provocation by a regime in Russia that seems to have lost all sense for the rule of law and of the most basic moral compass shows to us in the democratic West and to all peace-loving countries how important it is to be ready to defend and stand up to our common values and beliefs. It also shows how important it is to be united in the European Union and between transatlantic partners. Today, once again, in Europe, we know that we can count on the United States to stand up together with us to fight, literally and in a figurative sense, against these insane acts of violence and for the re-establishment of a peaceful international order based on the rule of law and cooperation. And the situation has already, and it was mentioned by Ambassador Weiss, to rethink in a number of countries the security policies with some surprising and radical results. I believe, given the new challenges, states need to look very carefully on how to meet those challenges and how to best be prepared for the new security situation. And this also goes for Austria. The situation, the discussion is not ended. It has only begun. And we need to discuss all aspects of our security situation. Now, my subject is well known. It is restitution and compensation. And there are two parts to it, of course. First, to remind you of the events from the assumption of power of the National Socialists in Austria in 1938, which led to the biggest organized theft of individual property in the history of humankind, up to the end of the war in 1945. And then, of course, the second part, what happened after 1945. And here again, it is not only because it's the subject of this conference, but also because it was extremely important. I should talk a lot about the role of the United States from the very beginning up to the present. Now, Professor Rowe just reminded us that one part of the title, also of my contribution in your program, is Lessons for the Future. However, I have to admit that I will leave this rather to those on the panel that follows that are much more competent to speak about those lessons to be drawn for the future. We also have, of course, Professor Rathkolb, who is not only a historian, but who is very much taking into account the present and the future in his research. So I look forward to those, and I will not really address much of this question in my own presentation. Now, we talk about the United States and the influence of the United States. And I have to be a bit more precise what I mean by that. When we speak about the role of the United States, of course, we mean the influence that the government of the United States took on events from the beginning. But there's also another aspect, and those are the non-governmental organizations. And we mean, of course, organizations that represented and represent victims. And those played a very important role, in particular Jewish organizations, played a significant role when we started our negotiations in the year 2000. There's also a third type of influence, which I would call pressure by the quote-unquote United States, and this was the pressure that came from attorneys, United States attorneys. And this phenomenon, which became evident in the mid-90s, as far as Austria is concerned, was a completely new experience. And quite frankly, I, like my colleagues, in particular also Ernst Sucharipa, were extremely puzzled and intrigued by this quote-unquote pressure exerted by lawsuits and by United States lawyers. We were confronted for the first time with such a strange animal under continental law, class action suits. I'd never heard about this before, but I was a quick learner, believe me. Now, the story really begins on the 13th of March of 1938, when troops of the German Reich marched into Austria, and the country known as Austria before was incorporated into the German Reich. Austria is a separate, independent, and sovereign legal entity of international law, ceased to exist, or legally more precise, continued to exist, but was unable to act on the international scene until 27th of April of 1945, when the Second Republic of Austria was proclaimed, at a time, by the way, when the Second World War had not yet formally ended. Now, as far as the United States is concerned, they did not, and this was equally to all other states, or the majority of states, with the exception of Mexico and a few other Latin American states, protest against the Anschluss, but even acquiesced in the beginning, for example, by closing the diplomatic and consular representations of Austria in the US and accepting that Germany would now represent Austria. This began to change quickly, and as was now already mentioned by Professor Rowe, on the 1st of November of 1943, in the so-called Moscow Declaration, together with Great Britain and the Soviet Union, it was made clear, and I quote, that Austria was regarded as the first country to fall a victim to Hitler-right aggression, and it was determined that Austria should be and would be liberated from German domination. The Allies regarded the annexation imposed on Austria by Germany on March 15, 1938 as null and void. And they declared that they wished to see re-established a free and independent Austria. Now, so far, so good. Everyone knows this, and everybody, my generation has learned this in school. We didn't learn the second part of the Moscow Declaration, which really only came up in the 90s and in the year 2000, and which reads as follows. Austria is reminded, however, that she has a responsibility which she cannot evade for participation in the war at the side of Hitler-right Germany, and that in the final settlement account will be inevitably be taken on her own contribution to her liberation. Now, immediately after the war, on 8th of May 1945, the question of how Austria would deal with her role during the 7 years of Nazi occupation, also in the light of the Moscow Declaration I've just mentioned, as far as restitution of stolen property and compensation of victims are concerned, arose, and was in fact immediately brought up by the Allies, in particular by the United States. Later, the US also officially recognized Austria as a liberated country, like the other countries occupied by Germany. Now, those negotiations which led up to the State Treaty were lengthy, arduous, sometimes quite bitter and unpleasant, because, and I say this very loud and clear, many of the attitudes that had led to disaster and catastrophe in the first place still, at that time, still existed, even and most particular among high officials in Austria, including also judges and others. In the end, an agreement was found, and I'm now talking about an agreement outside the State Treaty, but connected with the State Treaty, as to the amount of compensation and measures of restitution and for social measures for victims for all, including the United States, which together with other signatories of the State Treaty certified, sometime after the conclusion of the State Treaty, in a protocol binding under international law. Now, this international acceptance that Austria had done everything it was obliged to do under the State Treaty became unexpectedly important once again in the course of the negotiations of the year 2000. The provision of Article 26 of the State Treaty. Now, I want to remind you the State Treaty still is a document that is valid, although Austria, on her own unilateral will, declared after the fall of the Berlin Wall some of its provisions as non-applicable anymore, but the core provisions of the State Treaty and the State Treaty itself, of course, is still binding international law. And this provision of Article 26 of the State Treaty was crucial to the subject that I'm dealing with today. And it was the United States which had a particular interest that Austria would be held accountable also for material losses of numerous Austrian victims. I cannot deal with those negotiations in detail, but since we are talking about the role of the United States, I would say that the negotiation history of the State Treaty and the protocol I've mentioned shows that it was the US government which insisted much more than the other signatories on Austria, assuming its share of responsibility for the material damages of victims of World War II. The exchanges between the Austrian government and the US High Commissioner in Austria, by diplomatic standards, were sometimes extremely sharp and bitter. The US even threatened to cut or withhold part of the ERP funds, it is the Marshall Fund, if Austria would go ahead with her legislative plans to curtail the rights of victims of National Socialism. And I've read some of these exchanges of notes. They were very, very, very clear and very, very sharp. At the conclusion of the State Treaty, and after the US had certified that all Austrian obligations under Article 26 had been fulfilled, US direct involvement became less frequent. But they continued to support the efforts of victims to get compensation beyond what had already been agreed upon. And in 1953, negotiations started between the Claims Conference led by the legendary Nahum Goldmann, originally chairman of the Jewish Agency and the Conference on Material Claims against Germany, later also Austria, the so-called Claims Conference, mostly about the distribution of funds from heirless property. These negotiations ended, and I hesitate to say, but it's a fact, successfully, in the sense that an agreement was reached in 1961, and Goldman signed a declaration, which in German it's called Entfertigungserklärung, on 19 December 1961, stating that the Claims Conference would undertake no further steps vis-à-vis the Austrian government with a view to demand further legislative measures for the benefit of Jewish victims persecuted by the Nazi regime. Now this famous, or should I probably say infamous, Entfertigungserklärung became the unchangeable basis for negative responses to all attempts to reopen the chapter of Austrian responsibility for losses. And I have to say, to my everlasting shame, that I worked altogether 17 years in the legal office of the Austrian Foreign Ministry. The Entfertigungserklärung was the automatic response whenever we received demands to go beyond what had already been agreed upon. But this was Austrian politics, and this was the Austrian position in view of this so-called Entfertigungserklärung. Now, between 1961 and 1986, the beginning of the Wartime Affair, not much happened. Austria, in a way, established itself firmly as an island of the blessed, gaining in international stature. Mind you, these were the years of Kreisky, first as foreign minister, then as chancellor, and the reputation of Austria was growing. There was one exception. We suddenly raised the question of the role of Austria again and started to put in question the now generally accepted victim doctrine, and that was the Maubach Affair. Now, I lack the time to go into details. If you're interested, there's some literature about what this affair meant. Suffice it to say that a number of works of art were concerned, which Austria was at first reluctant to restitute to the owners or legal successors. In 1986, the Waldheim Affair broke loose and caught Austria and the Austrians by surprise. We had so comfortably settled down, found our place in the international community, and the last thing we wanted to do is think about the past. When the World Jewish Congress started to make the past of Kurt Waldheim an international top-page story during the election campaign to the Austrian presidency, suddenly the whole question of Austria's role in the war, suppressed for so long, started to come up again. In the end, the affair had the effect that for the first time, maybe for the first time at all, a broad discussion about the moral aspects of Austria's role set in, and I think I can say had a cleansing effect. Some positive consequences were the result. Chancellor Vranitzky, for the first time, spoke about moral responsibility, repeated and clarified further later by President Klestil and Federal Chancellor Schüssel. Taboos were no longer valid. And in 1995, the National Fund of the Republic of Austria for Victims of National Socialism was created. Anna Lessig, ever since then, has been the Secretary General, and I don't have to talk much about this because I know you will in your contribution at the panel. However, and this is also important to bear in mind, no new measures to restitute or compensate beyond the measures already taken 20 years and more ago were taken. So the National Fund changed the attitude, but it did not lead to any concrete results. The first significant step on the way to come to terms with Austria's past, not just with words, but deeds that deserve that name, started with gold. Again, I don't have the time to go into the question of the tripartite gold commission and the giving back of the gold that still remained in its possession. Among those countries who still had gold in that commission was Austria, to quite a significant amount. And when then Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, Eisenstadt, proposed that this gold, the value of this gold should be used for a fund benefiting the victims Austria was the first country to agree to that and to give up its claims to the gold. Now, the important thing about this gold issue was also, apart from the fact that a new fund was created for the benefits of victims, but it was also important because it was Deputy Secretary of State at that time, later became Deputy Minister of the Treasury, was in charge of this matter, and for the first time he got to know us and we got to know him, and he got to know Austria's history, which became very significant in the course of the negotiations then in the year 2000. After the conference in Brussels about the gold, there was once again another conference, this time about restitution of works of art in Washington, where 44 governments participated on the Washington Conference on Holocaust-era assets, and they adopted in 1998 principles for dealing with Nazi-looted art. Now, Austria came well prepared, as it had adopted already before a federal law dealing with the restitution of works of art in the possession of federal museums, which at the time, and I don't want to deny the flaws that this law has, was not only the first of its kind, but considered exemplary insofar as it provided for the initiative of museums concerned and did not shift the burden of proof to victims. So in 1998, and you know, of course, by that time, Europe and the world had already changed. There was some progress in those issues. But it was also the year of the first class action brought against Austria. And I don't think this is known. Austria was the only country where a class action suit was brought against the Republic of Austria, against the state. In all other cases, Swiss gold and works of art, and in Germany, all these dozens of class action suits, it was against companies, it was against individuals, but not against the state. In Austria was the only country where the class action lawyers, whom I got to know quite well, brought action against the state. When the coalition government ended in Klimaschüssel, ended in 1999, it had not resolved any of the important questions that were still pending. And this concerned both Zwangsarbeiter, forced laborers, and other victims of National Socialism in particular, and mostly, of course, Jews. And the 1st of October 1998 was also the year when the Austrian government decided to create the Austrian Historical Commission with a mandate to research and report about the whole complex of looting of property in the territory of the Republic of Austria and the acts of compensation or restitution by the Republic after 1945. Now we have, of course, a very prominent member of that commission with us, Member of Parliament Blimlinger, who was the research coordinator of that commission. I'm sure she will talk about this, so I don't need to go into any more details. In 1999, Austria's traditional position of being the first victims and not being responsible for anything beyond restitution of those assets that still existed became untenable in view of the activities of some important American Jewish organizations like the World Jewish Congress, and in particular the Claims Conference and its Secretary General at the time, Israel Singer. First against Switzerland, just to mention dormant accounts, gold, and then against other companies of other states. Newly resumed negotiations were underway with Germany and promised to be successful already from the beginning. Now, on 29th of January, In fact, just a few days before his term ended, Federal Chancellor Klima participated in the first forum on the Holocaust convened by Swedish Prime Minister Persson. There he met with a delegation of the Claims Conference with the Secretary General Israel Singer. And Singer told the Chancellor in no unclear terms, I was present at that time, that this time Austria would not escape her responsibility and would have to face its past and take some concrete and substantial matters. Klima couldn't, because his term was about to end, take any position on this. Now, just a few hours after his, literally a few hours after his controversial government had been sworn in on 4th of February 2000, the new Chancellor Schüssel made a significant step that eventually, almost exactly 1 year later, would have led to an agreement, the Washington Agreement, which presented the most sweeping resolution hitherto to unresolved issues relating to losses by victims of National Socialism. In this letter, only published very recently, to the Secretary General of the Claims Conference and other leaders of Jewish leaders of organizations, Schüssel said inter alia the following. I think I'm running a bit out of time, so I'm going to skip the citation. You can read this also in a documentary published by the Foreign Ministry, a very complete and comprehensive documentary about all acts of Austria when it comes to restitution. So although Israel Singer was surprised at first and hesitated for a moment to accept this offer, to negotiate with the government that had come into international isolation, just let me remind you of the so-called measures taken by the EU 14, he finally accepted the offer and negotiations could begin. Again, the United States, and more specifically Stuart Eisenstadt, stepped in and from the beginning played a useful and I would say essential and indispensable role. I do not think that we could have reached the agreements that we finally did reach in such a remarkable short period without Secretary Eisenstadt playing the role he did. One of the first decisions Austria made following the good counsel by Eisenstadt was to separate negotiations on compensation for Zwangsarbeiter and on other claims by victims. In Germany, they did not do that and they came to regret it. Chancellor Schüssel, less than 2 weeks after starting his term as Federal Chancellor, appointed former President of the Austrian National Bank, Maria Schaumeier, a special representative for the negotiations about compensations to Zwangsarbeiter. Again, I will not go into details of those negotiations. In May of 2000, a negotiation started with, again, Stuart Eisenstadt as facilitator, with victims groups, in particular the Claims Conference, but also other representatives of victims like late Gideon Eckhaus, we still remember him very well, and a number of American class action lawyers, including some of the real big names in the business. For those negotiations, Schüssel, as was already mentioned, nominated my good friend and colleague, our good friend and colleague, Ambassador Ernst Sucharipa, who unfortunately died much too young in 2005. In the beginning, the positions on those negotiations were far apart. Austria had the view almost everything that it was obliged to do after World War II to restitute stolen property and to compensate victims had been done. The other side obviously said, no, Austria had never done anything, so we have to start from scratch. I will not recount the course of the negotiations. Again, this can be easily found in literature, and I'm sure that Hannah Lessing will say something about it. But in October of 2000, the compensation for Zwangsarbeiter was finished, and on 8th of January 2001, we didn't quite make it in the year 2000, the agreement on restitution and compensation with other victims of Nazi persecution was signed. The Washington Agreement, as it became known. Again, I know that Hannah will say something about the contents and the measures that are foreseen in this agreement, so I can be short on this particular issue. In conclusion, I would like to cite Secretary of State Eisenstadt, Deputy Secretary of State Eisenstadt. He came to Vienna a few times, and he also spoke to the Austrian Parliament in full session. And he said on that occasion, as a result of my negotiations with the Austrian government to resolve class action suits against Austrian companies, I reached a series of agreements for private property compensation and restitution with then Chancellor Wolfgang Schüssel, with whom I developed a relationship of great trust and confidence. I negotiated intensively with Chancellor Schüssel and his talented aides, including, I leave out the name, Maria Schaumeyer, a remarkable person, and Ernst Sucherlieber for property negotiations. Our agreement resulted in a close of a total of $1 billion in payments. Austria has traveled a long time in recent years to come to terms with its wartime past. Austria has turned an important page in history. Now, the story didn't end in 2001 because it took still a few years until this agreement came into operation, because so-called legal peace was a prerequisite. Again, this was a very difficult time, but then in the year 2005, I believe, operations started in earnest of the settlement fund and of the arbitration panel. And since then, a report has been published by the settlement fund. I'm sure that Hannah will talk about it. And the restitution panel is still in operation. I believe that Austria has indeed learned from its history. And the pages of the moral responsibility of Austria for the time between 1938 and 1945 will never be closed. There can be no moral closure. The material aspects of the issue have been, to a certain extent, and to use the words of Secretary Eisenstadt, a certain measure of justice. A certain measure of justice, not full justice. Full justice can never be achieved, but a certain measure of justice has been achieved. Thank you very much.
The idea of the second part is that we have a series of independent, autonomous statements by this very distinguished panel relating to this subject. And we also have an order of battle. We will begin with Hannah Lessing. To my right, she is Secretary General of the National Fund of the Republic of Austria for Victims of National Socialism since 1995, and of the Fund for Restoration of Jewish Cemeteries in Austria since 2010. And she was a participant in these negotiations that were discussed in Hans Winkler's keynote address this morning. Eva Blimlinger is a member of parliament with the Greens Party. She was formerly director of the Academy of Fine Arts here in Vienna, and she was closely involved, as we heard, in the question of art restoration. Oliver Rathkolb is head of contemporary history at the University of Vienna, and as we all know, he has been very much a protagonist throughout the years on this whole question of Austria's coming to terms with its past. Matti Bunzl is director of our local museum, our Vienna City Museum. He also is very familiar, as a social anthropologist, he studied at Stanford and Chicago, so he knows America backwards and forwards. And for those of you who have just arrived in Vienna, I would suggest that during the break you make a dash down the street to see the metamorphosis of the Vienna Museum, which is taking place nearby in the Karlsplatz. So the idea is that we have these short statements by the panel, and then the next step would be to have responses, reactions amongst the panelists, and at the very end we will open the floor to general discussion. So without any Hanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tom. First of all, I would like to express my thanks to the organizers, Diplomatische Akademie Wien and Botstiber Institute, for having me, so I can be able to contribute to this conference from the point of view of the National Fund. After the so-called Anschluss during the Third Reich in Austria, more than 64,000 Jewish men, women, and children were murdered in the Holocaust. Another 130,000 were expelled. They had to leave their homeland, their families, friends, their whole existence, to live as refugees in a foreign land. Most never returned. With their departure and the countless who perished, a rich culture, a vital part of Austrian and European culture, was lost forever. More than 10,000 Roma and Sinti, as the second largest group of victims, were also murdered during the Holocaust. History teaches, but it finds no students. The famous Austrian writer Ingeborg Bachmann once stated, and in relation to the years of National Socialism, her diagnosis remained a grim reality in Austria for decades. And it is only during the last 3 decades that Austria as a nation has really started to face up to its history and to assume responsibility, as Hans Winkler already mentioned. One watershed moment, as mentioned, which marked the start of an important change, was the declaration of former Chancellor Franz Vranitzky of the shared moral responsibility. And by taking this stance, he initiated a long and difficult process of re-evaluating the Austrian history. One outcome of this process was the establishment of the National Fund of the Republic of Austria for Victims of National Socialism in 1995. The fund was one of the first expressions of a new historical awareness explicitly dedicated to recognizing and actively commemorating the victims of Nazism. Its establishment with the Austrian parliament is a clear signal that Austria is finally facing its responsibility in the name of all Austrians. It was a special honor to me to set up the new fund under the direction of a board of trustees, which is always chaired by the president of the National Council. Many of the tasks that the fund has taken on over the years go back to the Washington Agreement concluded between Austria and the United States in 2001. I had the honor, as mentioned, to be part of the negotiation team under our good friend, the late Ambassador Ernst Sucher-Ripper and Ambassador Hans Winkler, and Martin Weiss was the press attaché at the Washington Embassy at that time. We were a great team, I would say. The National Fund's first task was dedicated to the victims. The fund offers recognition and support to all victims of National Socialism of Austrian origin. Among the persecuted were not only Jews, but also Roma and Sinti, people persecuted on political grounds or because of their religion, their nationality, their ethnicity, because they were physically or mentally disabled, or because they were homosexual, and many other people who belonged to minorities or who were different for any other reason. To date, we provided material assistance as well as personal recognition to nearly 30,000 people since 1995, and behind every payment stands a person who has suffered. Today, victims of Austrian origin live in more than 70 countries all over the world, most of them today around 5,000 still in the USA. We remain aware that no payment, regardless of the amount, can ever compensate for this immeasurable suffering. Payments can only ever be a symbolic expression of regret and respect. In implementation of the Washington Agreement, the National Fund law was amended in 2001 to entrust the National Fund with the compensation of seized tenancy rights, household effects, and personal valuables. So I was also honored to be the Secretary General of the General Settlement Fund. And Stu Eisenstadt, who was mentioned already, quoted in the beginning that it was to close gaps and deficiencies after the restitution laws, the 7 restitution laws, which were passed under the Allied forces. A sum of $150 million was earmarked as compensation for seized tenancy rights. Applications could be filed up to the 30th of June 2004. Each of the approximate 23,000 applicants or their heirs received a lump sum of approximately 8,630 euros, $8,000 by that time. In keeping up with the Washington Agreement, the residue that could not be distributed is used for programs benefiting victims of National Socialism. Let me come to the General Settlement Fund. This fund was established, as said, in 2001 on the basis of the Washington Agreement. Its task was to acknowledge through voluntary payments moral responsibility for asset losses suffered by persecutees of the Nazi regime. Until 28th of May 2003, persons who had been personally affected by Nazi asset seizures and their legal successors were eligible to file applications. Of 20,702 applicants, 9,650 filed applications as heirs of persecuted persons. The other 53% filed applications also for their own losses. The applications were decided by the Independent Claims Committee chaired by Sir Franklin Berman. Let me just tell you one thing. The most important for us at the General Settlement Fund, but was already in 1995 in the National Fund, was that we were aware that most of the survivors were children at the time of their flight and wouldn't be able to procure any documentation. My father fled in December 1939 to Palestine, and he had to jump off the boat at night to come to Palestine. So he definitely didn't take with him any suitcase full of documents, documenting whatever his family possessed, even though they were of minor richness. In the beginning, when I was negotiating with the government at the time, I said, I need enough historians and the full opening of archives to be able to research for the survivors. Because I didn't want to turn down anybody who would say, well, I don't know what my grandparents had. I don't know what Uncle Shlomo once possessed. So the first thing was we listened, we drew up a family tree, and then at the archives, fortunately, Austria and Germany had very precise archives also concerning this asset seizure. We could trace what once belonged to them. So I had, at the peak of the work at the General Settlement Fund and the National Fund, 140 employees who were doing the whole research. Unfortunately, the amount that we had signed under the Washington Agreement was a $210 million capped amount, and therefore we could only pay out a pro rata payment, which in the end amounted only to 12%, because the Claims Committee recognized claims in the amount of $1.6 billion, which were never compensated for. 32% of them were for the educational and occupational losses, 22% for liquidated businesses, around 15% for stocks. The remainder was distributed among the other categories of losses, which were bank accounts, insurance policies, real estate, movable assets, bonds, mortgages, and other losses. In total, the General Settlement Fund disbursed around $215 million to around 25,000 beneficiaries. The arbitration panel for in rem restitution was also established at the General Settlement Fund under the chairmanship of Josef Eicher to decide on applications for restitution of public property. Eligible for restitution were real estate, superstructures, and movable assets of Jewish communal organizations that had been seized from their owners during the Nazi era and were owned by the Republic of Austria or by the provinces and municipalities by the statutory cutoff date 17 of January 2001, the date of the signature of the Washington Agreement. The arbitration panel recommended for 140 cases for in rem restitution an estimate of $48 million. The last filing period for applications to reopen proceedings expired at the end of August 2020. On 26th of April 2022, the Board of Trustees of the General Settlement Fund determined by resolution that the fund has completely fulfilled its tasks and is thus deemed dissolved pursuant to the General Settlement Fund law. President of the National Council, Wolfgang Sobotka, Chairman of the Board of Trustees, stated, and I quote, "With the dissolution of the General Settlement Fund for Victims of National Socialism, one of the Republic of Austria's most comprehensive projects for the restitution and compensation of Nazi property seizures has been completed." And on occasion of the National Fund's 15th anniversary, and Hans quoted already Stu Eisenstadt, stated the following: "Austria has traveled a long way in recent years to come to terms with its wartime past. While there are still elements of the Austrian political scene that provide reason for concern, I believe that as shown by the success of Austrian National Fund and the completion of the claims process of the General Settlement Fund, Austria has turned an important page in history." The work of the General Settlement Fund has a significance for Austria's historical self-image that goes beyond the compensation and restitution it has rendered. The National Fund understands this as a legacy that must be carried forward. Ladies and gentlemen, compensation and restitution representing the material side of dealing with the past are completed today. The immaterial aspects of dealing with the past will continue to exist. Today, in addition to recognizing and supporting the survivors of National Socialism, the fund carries out a wide range of tasks dedicated to commemorating, preserving, and passing on the memories and shaping the future together. Funding projects to help raise awareness about National Socialism. The fund is also in charge of the Austrian permanent exhibition of the former concentration camp and present-day museum site of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the disposition of the so-called airless looted art for the benefit of victims of National Socialism, the administration of the fund of the restoration of the Jewish cemeteries in Austria, which was established in 2011, as mentioned, in line with Austria's commitment in the Washington Agreement. Supporting and advising the victims and their families, for example, most actually acquiring Austrian citizenship, and the National Fund is responsible for the annual award of the Simon Wiesenthal Prize worth 30,000 euros yearly, which honors special civil society commitment to combating anti-Semitism and promoting education about the Holocaust. Ladies and gentlemen, given the tense situation we are facing worldwide, with issues of migration, restriction of human rights and civil rights, challenged by growing anti-Semitism, xenophobia, nationality and right-wing tendencies, we are once more confronted with questions about how to deal with the past and what ought to be learned from it for present-day societies. The National Fund strives to create a connection between the past, the present, and the future, combating the historical amnesia. Passing on the knowledge of the Holocaust enables us to plant the seeds of a better future amidst the soil of a bitter past, as it is so expressively described in the Declaration of the Stockholm International Forum of the Holocaust. Because the past holds answers, to some of the questions of the present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eva Blimlinger.
Thank you for the invitation to this panel, and I have to apologize, but I have to leave, I guess, after my statement, because I have to negotiate as a member of parliament. You have also to be in urgent matters. Around the time of the election of Kurt Waldheim as federal president in 1986, a paradigm shift was gradually taking place in Austria regarding the interpretation of the role of Austria, and especially Austrians during and after the National Socialism. Up to that point, official Austria and the majority of the population had the thesis, or were aware of the thesis, that Austria was the so-called first victim of the Third Reich, and therefore had not been involved in any of these actions. We were a victim, and that was it. This ideological construction was directed against the real victims of National Socialism in particular. The victim thesis was not only used in the area of foreign policy, it was also used against the real victims of National Socialism. Therein lies a dubious fallacy. As expedient as it was as a juridical and foreign policy construction, it was inadmissible as domestic policy and on moral grounds. It very soon proved suitable to forestalling restitution claims as much as possible or to reducing their efficiency. With this charge toward differentiation, and especially the historical scholarship on Aryanization, restitution and compensation, and the participation of the Austrians, in parallel with the discussions of the politics of memory, the focus came to fall on the questions of how Austria should address, process, and remember Nazism and its consequences. When the witnesses, so-called Zeitzeugen, in the schools campaign began in Austria in the mid-1970s, I went to a school where we had every year so-called Zeitzeugentage. It was mainly resistance fighters like Franz Dannemann, Rosa Jochmann, Hermann Langbein, who acted as Zeitzeugen, following in the tradition of emphasizing the role of Austrian resistance in the sense of the Moscow Declaration, and ignoring other groups of victims as Jews, Roma and Sinti, homosexual, etc. There were only resistance fighters in the school in the 1970s and early 1980s. The updating of the whole discussion of restitution and compensation claims in Europe during the early 1990s or late 80s and early 1990s has several motives and reasons and causes. To begin with, certainly the collapse of the real socialist countries in general and the fall of the Iron Curtain have some bearing on these discussions. The first cases that would be discussed here were those that become public after the reunification of East and West Germany. These were cases in which Jews wanted to reclaim their property in the GDR, which was initially Aryanized by the Nazis and subsequently nationalized by the GDR. In the course of reunification, the two German states had initially agreed to carry out individual restitution only partially, but also to make substantial global sums available. The distribution of funds was delegated to the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, Claims Conference, and some of the cases are until today not closed because they are at court. The case of Greta Beer raised the issue of the so-called dormant accounts. Beer had suspected that there were Swiss banks accounts in her father's name, but she and her brother were denied access to these accounts. To date, by the way, the established commissions, such as Volcker Commission, as I mentioned before, in Switzerland and in the United States, have found no Swiss bank accounts for the Baer family. It was also a very long process. Another area that should be mentioned, and was mentioned also by Hans Winkler in this context, is that of forced labor during the National Socialism. In Germany, the conclusion of the so-called 2+4 agreement on 12th of September 1990 led to an intensive discussion and finally at the compensation of former forced laborers. In the beginning, the Austrian Chancellor Victor Klima at this time had the idea that Austria has nothing to pay because we were not, we were victims and were not involved in this situation. As we heard, it was another solution. Just as the dormant accounts, as well as the subsequently discovered accounts that had been laid to rest, were the starting point for the establishment of several commissions, as mentioned, the Volcker Commission, but also in Switzerland. So it was in Germany with a generally unresolved issue of compensation for forced labor. And in Austria, it was, of course, art. So you can say Switzerland money, Germany forced labor, and Austria art. It was the initial political discussion on expropriation, alienation, compensation, and restitution began at the end of 1997 with the seizure of two works by Egon Schiele out of the collection of Rudolf Leopold, which is a foundation. At least at this exhibition, there were 4 pictures with a so-called, the New York Times called it a troubled past. The legal dispute over the portrait of Walli von Schiele lasted over 13 years, finally ending with a settlement in August 2010, in which the Leopold Foundation was allowed to retain the picture. In the fall of 1998, the Austrian National Council adopted the federal law on the restitution of cultural property of Austrian federal museums and collections, and it is to say that Austria is worldwide the only country who had a law to give back cultural property. And these were also, for instance, the city of Vienna and other cities and counties in Austria who gave back cultural property. In total, for the Republic of Austria, there were about 60,000 objects given back until today. After lawsuits were brought against Austrian banks and companies, both for expropriation and for forced labor, and on the initiative of the, at this time, president of the Austrian Jewish community, Ariel Musikant, the Historical Commission was established by the resolution of the Ministerial Council on the 1st of October 1998. The results of no less than 3.5 years of research encompass a total of 54 reports, which were published in 49 volumes, and some of them were the base of payments, for instance, for the forced labor, but also for the question of rented apartment, out of the compensation fund, the general settlement fund, and the national fund. It is to say you can find the reports and not the reports, the publications, the 49 books online in total. The General Compensation Fund was dissolved in 2022, 20 years after the Washington Agreement, and I have to say late and long. And from the today perspective, because it was also a question to the future, I would certainly prefer an administrative procedure, as you call it, Verwaltungsverfahren. We mentioned this also at the beginning, but there was time, it was always too long. But when you see Verwaltungsverfahren, it's easier than this sort of procedure in the fund. The case was and still is the trigger for commissions, advisory reports, and discussions. The Waldi case, the Bear case, the CA case. Today, for instance, for the discussion, it's the Loega Denkmal case, and we have ongoing discussions for memorials for homosexuals and queers, and also memorials for Roma and Sinti. On my view, it would be much better to have memorials for all groups and not that every group has their own memorial. But that's another discussion. If homosexuals, the antisocials, so-called asoziale, and Wehrmachtsdeserteurs were finally recognized as victims of the Nazis, took a long time, then of course this was only possible if at the same time other groups, in 2001 it was the so-called Trümmermutter, were also honored and the prisoner of war allowance increased. The approach taken by the federal government and the parliament is, in my opinion, the culmination of the process of leveling and or equalization of victims group, which has been the case in Austria since 1945. Every time when a group of Holocaust victims get compensation or whatever, then another group of people in Austria have to get money, because outgoing, as I mentioned in the beginning, with the victim thesis, there has to be a victimization of the whole country. They get benefits in 1958. The list, there's this really long list. It's not the time to mention it here, but the really worst thing was on my view, in 2001 and 2, under the FPÖ-ÖVP government, where it was, before it was one law after the other. So you have the law for the Holocaust victims, and afterwards the next law, it was the, for instance, Wehrmachtssoldaten. And in 2001 it was packed in one law, in the so-called Victims Welfare Act. The last decision of the Austrian Parliament is concerning the citizenship. Direct descendants of people persecuted by the Nazi regime may apply for citizenship and can keep their own citizenship late, also very late, and they can have a double citizenship, which is really a big theme in Austria, and it's not easy to get a double citizenship. In the ÖVP-FPÖ government between 2017 and 2019, forced by the FPÖ, they had the same idea or systems at the political agenda since 1945. Descendants of people persecuted by the Nazi regime versus citizenship for people Südtiroler. They also should have the possibility to apply for Austrian citizenship and keep the Italian one and have it both. But at this time, there was no deal. Südtiroler, Südtirolerinnen will not get a dual citizenship, only descendants of Holocaust victims. Nicholas Goldberg served 11 years as the editor of the editorial page at the Los Angeles Times and applied for the citizenship. He wrote, "The moment I'm treating my new citizenship not as a gift or as a meaningful compensation for past wrongs or as an exit visa from Trumpland, but as a small token of apology, a reflection of the complications and complexities of my family's history, and a reminder of the hold the past has on us, even as the generations pass." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Rathkolb.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's nearly impossible in 10 minutes to really produce a successful and meaningful message to you, but I will try to divide my brief presentations in two parts. One part will be some additions to what we have heard, and the second part I will deal with the issue why it took so long to Austria to come to terms with the Nazi past, and the other one will be, as our chairman has earmarked, deal a little bit with the present and the future. The first edition, which I find important since we talk about the US role after 1945 concerning restitution and compensation, is that if you go to the National Archives, you will find a large amount of material of property reports dating from 1945 and 1946. That means the first real documentation on the issue of Nazi loot, Aryanization under quotation marks, and restitution have been started by US forces. And especially when we go into the field of art, you all know the collecting point in Munich. US forces had a very important role to secure art throughout the occupation zones and military zones in Austria and Germany. I think this should be mentioned. It's a very important basis, I think, for the issue when we do historical research. If I continue on the question of art loot, there is one very important topic missing. This is art taken by the Soviet army as war booty in Germany and in Austria. And this includes a large amount of art objects owned by people of Jewish origin. Yeah? That means this is a dark chapter of history, and then unfortunately already a long time ago the Russian parliament, the Duma, decided not to discuss restitution. Yeah? It's for me a first sign that we have different moral values than Russia does, but no one cared about that at that time. The third issue is, and this brings me also a little bit in a critical perception and analysis of the point of views of US governments and US society. Now you had heard, and this is correct, the very important pressure and very important leading role of the Clinton administration, Stu Eisenstadt. But if I go back into the 1970s, no one in the US really cared about victims of the Shoah. It took a long time, and I will remind you on the discussion about technicians and experts of Nazi war industry, which have been brought to the US without taking care of their Nazi past. This was an offensive break of rules, by the way, and US Congress started an intensive debate in the 1970s. And I will also remind you, it's the Clinton administration which really brought the Washington Agreement, but I think it is also important to discuss the role of the Carter administration, which for the first time took human rights as a doctrine in foreign policy. And as you all know, they decided to establish the Holocaust Memorial Museum on the Wall, which is a very important museum for research, especially also for many Europeans. And maybe a brief sidestep to German politics of memory. Chancellor Helmut Kohl intensively tried to intervene in the establishment of the museum because he wanted to have a large chapter on German resistance, which was not accepted by the US government. But it gives you, I think, a good impression on how Germany in this period would like to be presented in such a museum. And when we come back to Austria in the 1970s, I also would like, since Simon Wiesenthal has been mentioned several times, draw attention to the really shameful debate between Chancellor Bruno Kreisky and Simon Wiesenthal, shameful with regard to Bruno Kreisky and his attacks against Wiesenthal. But when we go to the international public, when we go to the international reactions, a brief uproar and then business as usual. No one cared about that a few months later on. These, I think, should be reminded when we talk about the 70s. When we go to Austria, I think I will just briefly run to some of the issues, why it took so long to come to terms with the Nazi Party. I think it's an issue of generation. The wartime generation was still living, and many, when we take the example of Bruno Kreisky, but also other emigrants who returned, which was a minority which returned, they also had a different approach to discussing the Nazi past and anti-Semitism. Yeah? But it's still, I think, the dominant wartime generation, which we also find in the media. I remember clearly when we wrote, when we published a book on denazification in 1986 for the first time, before 1985, before the Wartime debate, we got a very nice review in Die Presse by a historian close to the Freedoms Party. And the end of the review was, this never must be used as a school book, yeah, because it's just ideology, talking about denazification or failed denazification. Now, this is 1985. In general, I think one of the reasons why it took so long and why also the Western allies stopped talking about coming to terms with the Nazi past between 1946 and 47 is the Cold War. Yeah? The main interest, both in Western Germany and in Austria, was taking everybody, including the former Nazis who were experienced soldiers in World War II, into the anti-communist alliance and really let us stop talking about the Nazi past. We have a special chapter in Austrian history, which I must admit is still a problem, yeah, for Austrian politics, is that the Western allies, pushed also by the Socialist Party, accepted a fourth party, which clearly had only one campaign interest, trying to represent very open the interests of former Nazi Party members. It's a Freedom Party after 1955, and you all know the stories. A fourth very brief issue, why it has been able for Chancellor Wolfgang Schüssel and his government to carry out what we have heard now by Ambassador Winkler and Hannah Lessing, why it was possible to carry out these negotiations so fast. Yeah? It has also one reason concerning domestic politics in Austria, that Jörg Haider was not directly in the government, but the Freedoms Party was in the government. And I just found an ancient article of myself from former days, a long time ago, and Haider in September 1998, and it was just during the discussions about setting up a historians commission, and I now translate and not quote in German. Jörg Haider on TV referred to that Simon Wiesenthal had the right to nominate a foreigner for the commission, and that the chairman of the commission, Clemens Jablona, is a member of a Jewish family and a member of the Jewish community of Vienna, and therefore this commission can never be independent because we have a foreigner and a Jew in the commission. This is Jörg Haider before he joined the government, and I could give you a large number of other issues. Now I come to the important aspect, but I will be very brief on the impact of all these discussions about restitution and compensation. I think the impact is enormous, yeah? But it was a debate in public. Yeah? I remember that one of the lawyers of these class actions at Fagan, who in my opinion was more a missionary than a lawyer, and he was also very corrupt in the end, yeah? Was invited to the University of Vienna, and I never saw the Festsaal so full and packed when he talked to us and we tried to listen. Yeah? But I think this was nevertheless very important, this media debate, yeah? Because it influenced a generation within the general public, within journalists, and now we have a large number of issues, discussions about street names. Mrs. Blimlinger mentioned the Luega memorial, but it's much deeper. Yeah? Institutions are interested in finding more about the past. The Foreign Office, for example, just have started a new project also dealing with the Nazi past of many diplomats after 1945, after 1938, and then continuing after 1945. And I remember that I was beaten up in an internal note by then Foreign Minister Alois Mock when I published an internal report on this issue of former Nazis becoming high-ranking Austrian diplomats. You can see how things have changed. Now I have to come to the, I think, most important issue in the present is where is Austrian society heading for? Yeah? And I have to present, unfortunately, both a positive view, but also a very critical view. The positive view is that, especially on the level of the media, yeah, we have a complete change of interest. Yeah? The media, like never before, have been very interesting in presenting critical, for example, TV documentaries in Austrian public TV, but also the private TV is following. I just will mention the new series of documentaries on the Gauleiters of the Ostmark. That means this is different. Also, the elites and institutions are different. For example, within 2 weeks, the University of Vienna has presented and opened a new monument commemorating the persecuted member of the history departments at the University of Vienna, students and faculty. And just 2 days ago, we have renamed one of our prominent lecture halls in becoming Gerda Lerner Hall, the pioneer of women's studies in the US who was of Austrian origins. That means this is only a tiny bits and piece I could give you for, I think, a week examples from all over Austria and different institutions. When we, however, go into our schools, and a former student of mine, Dr. Philipp Nick, has conducted a public opinion poll in Austria, Viennese schools of all school types within a different class, a specific class, we still find a rather high percentage of young people, pupils, who have no idea about National Socialism. They are not even able to define anti-Semitism. And this, I think, is the most important message. Yeah? we have to continue. That means it's a permanent political educational project to continue to talk about National Socialism and the Nazi past from class to class, from generation to generation. And I think this is really something which we have to become aware of, because if we go to public opinion polls in our society, approximately 40% of the people would like to stop the discussion, draw a line, talk about other issues, but not talk about the Nazi past. That means also with regard to our society, we still have to carry on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rathkolb. Matti Bunzl.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to sit next to Oliver and hear Hanna and Eva. It's interesting because it's sort of a throwback to a previous life I had when I was, for the most part, a researching historian and scholar working on these issues. And I say this because I'm going to speak today from a completely different perspective, although I've worked on exactly those issues as a historian, but now I'm tasked with the nitty-gritty of being the head of an institution that is one of the institutions that deals with these questions in practice. And it reminds me of the strong connection between politics and actual institutional goings on, but also the difference in register, because it's I mean, everything you guys said is not just true, but analytically very powerful, and yet, and this is not an excuse, the things like restitution on the ground are unbelievably messy and complicated, and not because there is at this point anyone serious who is opposed to it. I mean, you outlined the struggles to get to the present point. Speaking as the director of the museums of the city of Vienna, the institution that administers the collection of the city of Vienna, I think I can safely say that across the political spectrum, all of them, no matter how right-wing, there is no one who thinks that we as administrators of this collection should do anything other than return stolen objects and other objects that were accrued illegitimately to their rightful owners. I don't see that. I see some people who are less enthusiastic than others, but if I went to City Hall and said, what do you guys think? Should we return things that we don't, properly have ownership to, that were stolen? Of course, everyone wants to do it. So, and that, the history, how we got there, you guys laid out. In the city of Vienna, it was a smidgen later than in federal Austria. So the federal Austria was 1998, I believe. In Vienna, the moment was 1999 when it was decided that the city of Vienna would, look through its collections actively and determine or try to determine all the objects that belong to the city unlawfully, and to initiate restitution. And that is also the moment when this was institutionalized. So now we're going to the level, this is what they said in City Hall, and then it came to the Museum of the City of Vienna, and then my predecessors at that point, because I was writing, being strongly influenced by Oliver's scholarship that you talked about, I was writing my first book on exactly these issues at the time. But my colleagues, my now colleagues at the Wien Museum, were thinking, how can we actually, enact justice in this collection? And so ever since 1999, we have employed a professional historian who's a very, very fine scholar to do nothing other, and that sounds like, that's a huge task, nothing other than to go through the collection of the city of Vienna to figure out which objects may belong to the city improperly. And this brings me to maybe my central message from sort of the real world of restitution is that, and I guilty as charged, I mean, when I thought of restitution and cases, art, restitution, of course I think about the Goldene Adele, the lady in gold. I mean, there's a whole film about it. And, we have this image, which is, that is a reality. I mean, there are objects of absolute world cultural importance that were stolen, and there were people who were clearly the victims of that theft and who made an incredibly courageous stand against the country of Austria to reclaim this property. And this is the most famous case is, of course, the Klimt, the Goldene Adele. That said, that is the total exception. For the most part, the objects that belong to the city of Vienna illegally and unlawfully are not worth anything or worth very, very little. Number one. Number two, for the most part, descendants have no idea that these objects exist, let alone that they exist in the collection of the city of Vienna. I'm not saying this to be, I just want to give you a sense of what, so because if I do nothing else, I want you guys to not think about the lady in gold when you think about the topic of restitution. And I'll give you two examples of what restitution, I mean, we're literally like in the middle of the first case I'm not going to mention names, of course, but the basic problem or issues are very typical. So the first case is something that is unresolved, and I have no idea how we're ever going to resolve it, and you'll see why in a second. And then I'm going to talk about a second case that is also somewhat complicated, but is resolved in, to me, beautiful fashion. And so the first case is a bust of Beethoven. I think we have 200 busts of Beethoven, some more important than others. Beethoven, was an inspiration to lots of artists who then sculpted him. So this is a bust of Beethoven's that our researcher, Michael Vladica, has identified as stolen. This is a stolen bust of Beethoven. And then, so this is easy to determine, or relatively easy to determine. We then go to the next step. I mean, who is the legitimate owner, which, given that, unfortunately, the people who were robbed are essentially all dead at this point, we're talking about heirs. Well, in this case, there are 200 heirs. What do you do? I mean, we're not going to be like King Solomon and, smash the bust and give everyone a little shard. In theory, one could sell this bust, which is not worth all that much. I mean, we're not talking Klimt. We're talking, it's some bust. I mean, if we're lucky, it might be 5,000, maybe 7,000 euro. So hypothetically, if all 200 agreed that we sell it and then split the, do you see again, I don't want to sound like we're the victims. It's just a dilemma. Like, what the hell do we do with that? So that's one story, and it's a very common story. And 200 is on the large side, but if it's two who can't agree in terms of heirs, it's just as bad. It's not that straightforward in practice. The other case, which is another kind of case, which had a very, very happy resolution, is another. The Beethoven bust is one piece. Michael found a set of objects that we have in the collection, and definitely robbed, stolen. What is it? It is, and I forget the exact number now, but it's somewhere around it's 80 items, or maybe a little more than that. And what they are is they are stencils used by the Wiener Werkstätte to create textiles. These are very interesting in terms of cultural history because, you all know the Wiener Werkstätte, incredible designs, very, very important. That said, there is no market for the stencils. Sotheby's is not auctioning off stencils of anyone. On top of that, you have to picture these things. These are massive metal objects that you use to then print, curtains or fabrics, etc. So Michael finds this, and he in this case it's great because there isn't clear air, and this is a lovely elderly woman at the time. This is right when I came here, so it's about 6 years ago. who lives in New York in a tiny apartment in New York. What apartment in New York is not tiny unless you're, super rich? Who gets a phone call from us. I mean, it's literally, imagine the scene. She had no idea, none. You are the rightful owner of 80 plus humongous heavy stencils. What should when can we send them to you? Because that is what restitution means. She is the rightful owner, and she was lovely, and she was obviously surprised, and the reason this had a beautiful resolution, and I thought it was a beautiful gesture, and I'm so happy with it, is we talked to her on the phone, and what she asked us to do in the end, or what she suggested, was that it's very meaningful to her in terms of her family history, and she talked to her family. She had kids and grandkids, and there were sort of 6 units, family units, and she asked that, and I think she chose them, 6 stencils. So each family unit would have one of those stencils, and she regifted the remaining stencils back to the collection of the city of Vienna, which meant that we never shipped all the 80 to New York, but only the 6. And that's a very happy resolution, which is also, also restitution. In both cases, we're not talking about money, and it's in rare cases, it really is about money, but in most cases, it really isn't. It's about other things, and so I share with all our other speakers, and I think most people in our world, the deep desire to continue this work. It is important, but I hope I give you a little bit of a sense of how tricky it can be on the ground. And the last thing I want to say is that we thank you for mentioning our new museum, which is taking shape on Kaisplatz, which we're hoping to open in December of 2023. One thing that we decided to do is, this is, of course, it's a new sort of era in the history of the museum, and it's a good moment to take stock of important things. And one of the decisions we have taken is to do a big exhibit on the practice of restitution in the Wien Museum right at the beginning. So one of the exhibits that will happen in 2024, in the first slew of special exhibits, is an exhibit that Michael Vladyka and Gerhard Milgram, or my 2 colleagues who work on this most closely, are preparing. And it's going to be about these topics, but it's also going to be about this nitty-gritty of what actually happens with these objects. And I hope you will all come and see it. Thank you.
Well, let me thank you all for these presentations. We now move into the final phase of this session. And the first part would be to get any reactions or comments from the panelists themselves. We'll have a run through the panel, and then we'll open the floor for discussion with everybody else. Hannah, would you like to?
Yeah, I'd love to make 2 quick remarks. Matti and I we have been working for a long time together, and so I would like to make 3 remarks on art restitution. Yes, it's not always about very important and very valuable things. So we have, for example, in the National Fund, we are receiving the art which is not restitutable, heirless, which never is, because some families, you just don't find them. Yeah. But so the National Library, for example, in cases of books, when there is no ex libris in it, there is no chance, because every owner, every family would have a Brehm's World of the Animals. So you would not find them. So the National Library said, okay, you know what, we keep the 8,000 volumes in our library, and we make an evaluation and we give you the money in kind. One very nice thing is that in the beginning, the National Fund, even though we were not really tasked to do so, we have an art database with more than 10,000 objects in it, where not only for transparency, we say when it was restituted, if it was restituted, and why it was restituted, but through this art database, in unsolved cases, one client of mine in Israel called me and said, Hannah, this is a painting which was hanging at my grandparents' home. We made the research, the provenance research, and it turned out it was Freddy's. He was the only owner. And at that time, Michael Vladyka and also the city councillor for art said to me, Hannah, we don't want to ship it. It's not very valuable. It was Schödelberger, a small, nice love letter painting. take it with you to Israel when you go next time. So I was sitting in the airplane and restituting the art. And I cannot tell you, when Freddie opened the package, it was really homecoming. And so these are the things in art which can happen. I brought home to my father, after 70 years, 2 rimonim, which are the Torah crowns. I was called from Israel that they've been found in a sales at an auction house, and it was written in Hebrew, Heinrich Lessing, and that there are not many Lessing Jews. So I researched, yes, it was ours, and I had to buy them out of the auction, which is fine. But like this, 70 years later, family history returns. One problem about art restitution, it's a legal basis for official collections, not private collections. So there is much art also in private hands. So right now, Israel is working on a legal basis, because that's interesting. In Israel too, there are in museums belongings to looted art. And the fact is that we have been approached now by somebody who said, I went into my grandparents' house, it was sold, and I found the painting and furniture. I'm sure it was there since 1938. Can you help? And this is something which happened through what we did over the last 25 years, that some people say, there was something. I think I have to deal with it. This painting has bad choo-choo. So we researched, we found the heirs in Australia, and through Lucas Strohmeyer, our ambassador there, we could restitute this painting from private to private. So this is about art, which is a never-ending story. We're not yet there. So just one remark to what Oliver Rathkolb was saying. Lessons learned. 25 years, we are doing 27 years of National Fund. In the Ministry of Education, there's Arena Nate. We have the original site of Mauthausen. We have done so much, and still we have to see that during the pandemic and other things, we have rising anti-Semitism, xenophobia. What did we do wrong? And it's true that maybe the medias are showing movies and documentaries, but if you look at the numbers, today the youth is watching social media. They're watching YouTube. They're not watching ORF, even if we have ORF 3, and they are wonderful documentaries. It's at 11 o'clock at night. They're either in the discotheques or we are sleeping. So it doesn't reach the people. So every generation has to learn by again and again. And I'm co-head of delegation of the Austrian delegation to the IRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, where we have defined 2 definitions which are used, in fact 3, anti-Semitism, because you can only fight something that you know. So it's a definition of anti-Semitism. There is a definition on anti-Ziganism, and there is a definition of one really problem, distortion and denial of Holocaust. So we are using it in justice, we're using it in police trainings, etc., because we need to continue, as Oliver said, it's an ongoing process, and every generation has to learn again. Sorry to have been long, but...
Thank you. One remark to art restitution, or restitution in general. One of the difficulties, also in our negotiations, was the different concept of bona fide. As a lawyer, and I'm sure lawyers will know what I mean, in the American common law system, you can never acquire property if it was once stolen. In the continental law system, you protect bona fide purchases. In other words, this is why the Austrian law only applies to public institutions and to museums, and only federal, as a matter of fact, federal institutions. The Bundesländer followed suit then on their own. But this is an unresolved question. It will remain unresolved to a certain extent. The second very short remark, I just want, because it hasn't been mentioned yet, and I feel we should mention the Future Fund. The Future Fund is one outcome of the Washington Agreement in a larger sense, and it has now been since 2004, I believe, spend 2 million euros every year for research projects, having to do not only with remembrance and the Holocaust, but also with projects that have to do with protection of human rights, democracy, etc. This is very, very important because I was very impressed what Professor Rathkolb said, what we need to do in the future. This is the kind of things we need to continue. And unfortunately, Mrs. Blimlinger has left because it will be up to Parliament to prolong the Future Fund, which is going to expire next year. And I think we need institutions like this in order to do all the things that have been mentioned here. Thank you.
Very, very briefly, sorry, but I would again also underline what Ambassador Winkler has said. The Future Fund is doing a remarkable work because they are also financing project within the broad scenery of public art projects and not just academic research. And I do very much hope that the Parliament works a little bit faster than in the past. Yeah? One issue, I think, what we should earmark in the future, and therefore I also would like to again talk briefly on the Luega monument, is that we stop teaching in schools National Socialism, started in 1933 in Germany, in Austria 1938, and ended in 1945. Yeah? You have a long history of racial anti-Semitism. I'm not talking about religious anti-Semitism, yeah, which you have to include. Yeah? And I always have problem with our experts at the university, yeah? Because for them, the battleground, under quotation marks, to cite the title of an exhibition of the Jewish Museum, started after 1918, and this is not true. Yeah? There were heated battles, yeah, fueled by anti-Semitism and racism pre-1914. Yeah? And I think this is one issue. The other issue is that National Socialism, racism, anti-humanitarian perceptions, attitudes did not stop in 1945. In the opposite, yeah, and the American forces also conducted public opinion polls in their zones between 1945 and 1955, and it's really horrible when you read the results. And this is unfortunately something which is not in our school books, which is not taught in the schools. And I think if we really have a mainstream approach, so to speak, yeah, to the origins of racist anti-Semitisms, the effects, so to speak, the brutal effects in the Shoah and National Socialism, but also carry on after 1945 to the present. I think this is something we should head for.
At this point, we can open the floor for discussion. I would ask, as always, that you identify yourself, tell us who you are, and get to the point quickly. I think we have a question over here.
Good afternoon, Ulrike Neuhauser. I'm a trained political scientist from the University of Vienna, doing one semester at Columbia in New York. My question is, I think it's very important what you said in the end. It needs to be taught at school or maybe even started at kindergarten. Thank you, Professor Rathkolb, for pointing out the latest situation, because I think what is also important is anti-Semitism, yes, but at the same time also looking at the racist speech that is approaching even more so. I remember when Mr. Kicker was still in the national government, there was once an article in the Kronenzeitung, a tabloid everyone knows, from people writing to the Kronenzeitung asking why certain expressions Kickl used were, so to speak, problematic, because they were used from in the Nazi German times. And so that people of this age in the 21st century are not aware of these kind of expressions anymore, I think is very worrisome. So I think you have to take it from both ends. You have to do the education from the children, but also, like Mrs. Lessing said, you have to be active on social media And you have to, I mean, how can any elected politician, without any consequences, use this kind of language as a representative of a national government in the 21st century? I mean, sorry, give me a break. This must not be allowed ever again. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? We have one here.
First of all, thank you to all the panelists for your enriching dialogue. My name is Annalise. I'm a law student in Paris, and my question is more on the first topic that was discussed, but it's certainly tied into everything that has been discussed so far. I just noticed that we're in a room full of academics and politicians and diplomats, and it can be really easy to have a optimistic, solution-based dialogue. I was wondering, especially in light of recent political events, how we can evolve diplomacy to ensure to the public that it's still a viable solution, because I've seen that especially many young people are losing trust in the systems that we have set up. Thank you.
Should we collect a few and then?
I can only say let's have another conference about this, because this is the essence of what we all need to do. But I don't think there's no quick answer to that. I mean, I don't have this quick answer. I can only hope that young people are educated in a humanitarian sense. And yes, we have to start at school. The school education from the beginning is probably the most important. But I was sure that even law students realize the issues that being discussed today. I doubt it. So let's go out, yes, for academics, for institutions like the DA, like universities, let's go out and teach. But let's do it in the sense of let's do it together, because teaching in the sense of standing here and telling the young people how they should think is the wrong way. I'm optimistic in a way that we will achieve that.
Yes, I do agree. It's usual suspects. This is what I have been facing for the last 27 years, but I'm also optimistic because I'm really meeting a lot of young people who are very engaged. But I think that when we start talking, we are sending our teachers, for example, to Yad Vashem to learn how to teach about the Holocaust. When do you start talking about Shoah, Holocaust? When is it early enough without that it becomes, oh, I'm not guilty and I don't want to have to do anything with it? So sometimes for me, maybe the better start is to start much earlier and not only talk about the Holocaust. We have to teach kids at the age of 5 mindfulness. I went to the French school. I grew up with Palestinians, with Congolese, every color, every ethnicity, every religion. It was wonderful. They were my friends. I didn't even bother if he had a star or a cross or another skin color. And I think really it's time that we start much earlier to reach the kids and say, we're human. It sounds very pathetic, I know, but I really believe in this.
I think there is one institution, unfortunately, which we are not addressing. Yeah? And it's really, I think, something which we should draw our attention to in the future. This is business. Yeah? I did a research study together with a team on forced and slave labor in the steelworks of the first Alpine, which was the former Hermann Göring Werke in Linz. And we had heated discussions with the representatives of the worker, with the Betriebsräte, the working councils. But in the end, yeah, our project really was communicated into the steelworking community. And after a few years, they even established a museum there on forced and slave labor. And there is, I think, an interesting study at Princeton University where they did research, but also tried to have moderated discussions, town hall meetings in a Chinese factory, a textile factory, and at Princeton University with administrative personnel. And the interesting issue was that this group, which was integrated in a moderated discussion once a week for 2 or 3 months, after the period had a higher amount of more active democratic attitudes. Another control group was just informed in an authoritarian way. That means we should also find ways, and the Austrian Railway did a fantastic project, which also was where the National Fund and Future Fund have been involved. They asked young workers to work on the history of the railways during the Nazi period. And this was a very successful project, which you normally don't do with these young workers. Also, so you train them. And I think we should also include business into this educational efforts.
All right, any other final questions or comments from anyone?
Just a quick comment to Hannah and also to Mr. Bunzl, because we had the same case in Washington, D.C., when a painting was restituted and it was of minor value. I mean, minor, it's like $2,000 painting, and we shipped it with diplomatic courier, because if you give that to an art shipping company, the price for the shipment is more than the painting. But the family was so happy. The grandfather, the father, 3 children came along. So I think we must never really stop. Even if it gets super complicated, it is worth it so much. So never a Schlussstrich for these kind of things. And I think the work that you do there is extremely important. And also to Professor Rathkolb, I totally agree. We had this exhibition of the Austrian railroads in Israel. And again, it was not only the story of the resistance in the railroad, because there's not only resistance, there's also quite many other things that were happening, but it's so important to get the private sector on board, because much of it is happening in public collections, in the public sector. A lot has happened, but a lot more could still be done and would be super helpful for this discussion. But thank you all for what you're doing. Thank you.
All right. Well, listen, I think we've come to the witching hour. It's lunchtime. So first of all, very warm thanks to all of our panelists and to Hans for doing the keynote speech. Thank you all for coming and for your questions and comments. We will pause now for a lunch break. And at 2 p.m., we will start again. The next session is on Austrian-U.S. economic history, the memory of financial crisis. So lunch should be served next door, and then we will come back here at 2 p.m.